Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the 57th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting will be recorded to share online, and this afternoon you will receive an email with any of the resources that we talked about today, as well as a link to the recording so you can watch it again or share it with friends. In addition, we are pleased that the Bookworm programs are now available on YouTube instead of just our website. So if you've missed any, you can check them out there. Just in case you're joining us for the first time, I'll mention a couple of things about the way we use Zoom in this program. We enjoy the conversation and camaraderie, so please feel free to chime in using the setting everyone in the chat so that we can all see what your responses and comments are. My colleague Kayla Robinson will be monitoring the chat and pasting in information there related to the program. But if you have questions that you would like our panelists to answer, please put those in the Q&A section so that we can keep them together for the end of the program. You can also take a look at the questions that other people are answering and give it a thumbs up if it's a question you also have. That's called an upvote, and we'll send it to the top of the queue. We have our live machine captioning turned on today as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program. You can toggle that on or off or change the size. And then we also have side-by-side mode enabled, so hopefully you can slide the divider to change the size of the slides and the speaker. I can only control so much of what you see, so play around with your screen a little bit if it's not quite to your liking. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to 1900. I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the single largest land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right, if you haven't answered yet, click very quickly and I will end the poll and share the results. All right, well, over half of our participants say they would share the caricature with family and friends, because after all, you're a celebrity. So I love that. I love that we're all sturdy enough to to think that'll be okay. Although after you see some of these caricatures that Allison shares with us later, you might change your mind. So I think the other options are great ones too, and I love this poll question because it does really make you think and consider what it would be like to be a target of such notoriety. So thank you everybody for participating in that poll question. I would like to thank Doug Johnson for sponsoring today's episode of The Bookworm and for being such a faithful participant as well. So thank you very much, Doug. For today's conversation, I am pleased to welcome back Clayton Lewis, who very recently retired as the Clements Curator of Graphics Material. I'm glad that we couldn't keep you away for too long. And then also joining us from the staff is Paul Erickson, the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Paul to introduce today's guest.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I am so excited to welcome my good friend, Allison Stagg, to the Bookworm today. Allison and I have been friends for 14 years. I had to go back and do the math. It's really great to have you here. Allison Stagg is a specialist in 18th and 19th century American and British visual culture. She received her BA from Mary Washington College and her MA and PhD in art history from University College London. Her postdoctoral research has been supported by fellowships from the Paul Mellon Center for British Art, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, and the American Philosophical Society, among others. She's published widely on the subject of historical American and British caricature, with recent articles in Print Quarterly and Imprint, the Journal of the American Historical Print Collectors Society. She has taught early American history and art history at several German universities. And in 2016, she held the Terra Foundation Visiting Professorship in American Art History at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She is currently a research associate in the Department of Architecture and Art History at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany. Her first book, which she is here to talk about with us today, is called Prints of a New Kind: Political Caricature, published in the United States, 1789 to 1828, just published by Penn State University Press. This book, and I'm going to do my QVC voice now, gives a new definition to the term sumptuously illustrated. It is absolutely gorgeous. Often when you read books about historic visual culture, there's a lot of description of images that either you can't see at all, or you can only see in kind of muddy black and white reproductions. All of the images in this book are in full color, and it is spectacular. So there's a discount code in the chat. Treat yourself, you deserve the best. This book was published with generous support from the College Arts Association, the Goethe Henkel Stiftung, and the American Historical Print Collector Society. So welcome, Allison, to the Bookworm. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for that really nice introduction. And thank you as well for mentioning the illustrations in this book, because this was really important to me when I was doing the research, and I was thinking about how it would be published, how it would look as a book.
Right.
And it was really important that those images were in full color. It was really important that even the caricatures that were not colored, that they were reproduced in color, so that you could get a sense of the age of the paper. You could see the creases in the paper. So I'm really pleased, and it's with extreme thanks to the College Art Association, to the Goethe Henkel Stiftung, and to the American Historical Print Collector Society, because they provided the funding that really made it possible for those images to be in color. So thank you for mentioning that. I'm really pleased how the book turned out. Yeah,
no, it's absolutely beautiful. And the doing reproductions of that quality is expensive. So
it is.
It's wonderful that you were able to get support for that. Can you just tell us a bit about how you came to this topic? So when, I think people who are familiar with early American caricature have maybe seen some of the cartoons from the era of the Stamp Act, for instance, showing tarring and feathering, some caricatures of British political figures from that period. You start later, after the revolution. So talk a bit about how you came to this project.
So I had a plan in my head about what I wanted to study, and I really wanted to study British paintings. That was my game plan. That was my, future. It was in British paintings. And after I graduated from Mary Washington College in Virginia, I was looking at PhD programs, and I was also thinking about living abroad. I was thinking about going to London. So I looked at one-year master's programs in London, around the UK, actually. And I got into University College London, and I was really excited to work with Professor David Weinman, who had worked on William Hogarth, but he also worked on British artists from the 18th, 19th century. So I ended up in London for 1 year, thinking I'm just in London for 1 year. I'm just going to work on British paintings in London, then I'll go back to the US. But when I arrived in London, the course had been canceled, and it was a last minute cancellation. Everybody was running around trying to figure out what are we going to do with these students that have arrived. And the option was British caricature, to do a course on British caricature. And I really resisted. I wanted to study British paintings. I was stuck in the 18th, 19th century, but paintings, not prints. I knew nothing about prints. I knew nothing about British caricature. And I remember, sifting through a book on British caricature and thinking, I don't want to study this for 1 year. What am I doing here? I spoke to, my professors from undergrad. I spoke to curators that I had interned with at big museums, and they all said, just stick it through. It's 1 year, then you come home to the US and you do what you want to do. So here I am enrolled in this British caricature course, really resisting it. And slowly the subject matter won me over. And we would meet at the British Museum. We'd go to the study rooms. We would look at all these beautiful, vivid, colorful caricatures, prints that I really knew nothing about, but I was really engaged with. These were prints that, were published with such immediacy, and there were so many of them. I couldn't believe how many caricatures were being published in just, 1 day, 1 week in the 1790s, early 1800s. But I think because I was an American abroad, I was there in an election year, it was 2004. I started to become a bit more interested in America's founding. I started to read a bit more about what was happening after the War of Independence. I had been gifted a biography on John Adams by David McCullough. And I'm reading, about John Adams being in London, how he was described. He was rotund, bald, ugly. And I just thought, this is great. This, of course, a caricaturist would want to put John Adams in a caricature. So initially I started looking for American politicians in British caricatures and not finding anything and being really surprised by that. And then I turned my eyes to New York, Philadelphia, Boston to see what was being made there in terms of caricature at that same time period. And my eyes were really opened. There were not a lot of caricatures. It was nothing like in London with these hundreds of caricatures being published. There were 1 or 2 a year, sometimes 4 caricatures being published. Many of them had not been saved, so the descriptions were in newspapers. And the more digging I was doing on American caricature, the more I was shifting my attention really to looking at American caricature away from British art and British caricature. And that's really where this research topic came from doing a master's on British caricature in London. And I ended up staying on to do my PhD in London at University College on this subject matter. So I was an American living in London, working on an American subject, and having to spend a lot of time flying back and forth to the US, applying for fellowships, going home to visit family and friends, and then tacking on 2 or 3 days to do research. I'm originally from New York, which is wonderful because I could go to the New York Historical Society, the New York Public Library. I could make my way up to Worcester. I could go to Philadelphia, I could go to DC, and I could see the collections in person and meet with the curators and the archivists and have conversations about it. So that's really how it began.
So just before you tell us more about your book, this is such a deeply archival project, and for people who look at the book, I mean, the evidence is on every page of how many libraries and archives you visited. Can you tell us just a bit about what one of your favorite experiences was in an archive doing research for this project?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I have a lot of fun discoveries and fun moments in the archives, but probably my favorite moment, which sticks out, is working on, so there are 2 caricaturists during this time period, and I'll talk more about them. in a little bit, but one of the caricaturists, his name is James Aiken. And James Aiken is a really fascinating character, and he left so much behind because he would write letters. He was consistent in advertising what he was up to in newspapers. So there are lots of notices and advertisements that he placed in newspapers about where he was, what he was doing, what he was publishing. So I had a timeline for James Aiken, when he was born, where he was at certain times. And so I was spending a lot of time in newspapers looking for more information about Aiken. And I had found in secondary literature a reference to where James Aiken was at a certain time when he had arrived in Philadelphia. And this was an article that had been published in, I think, 1910. It was quite old. So there was no footnotes, no endnotes, no citations really, but there was a reference to a newspaper advertisement, or a notice, I should say, that Aiken had placed about where he was. And there was no other information. And it was important for me because it told me where he was in this time period. And that kind of opened up a whole new story for Aiken. And I was going through the newspapers. I was, anytime I was in an archive, I was looking in these Philadelphia newspapers, not finding this one notice. I was using the online databases. I couldn't find anything. And then one day I was talking to a friend of mine who was at the time the director of the Morse Jumel Mansion in Washington Heights in Manhattan. And I was just telling her I was so frustrated. I wanted to know more about this notice because Aiken included so much in these notices. And this was just a small little reference, and it just gave the address, and I wanted more. And so I mentioned this to her, and she said, well, at Morse Jumel, we have like 20 or 30 newspapers. Maybe you should come up and we can go get lunch and you can just go through the newspapers and see maybe it's there. And I didn't, I wasn't even sure about the year, even though the article had mentioned a year. I wasn't even sure if that was right at this point. So the Morse Jumel Mansion does have newspapers. They have about 30 of them, and they range from the 1760s to the 1870s. And I got there, we went upstairs in the Morse Jumel Mansion. We opened up the storage, we pulled out the newspapers, and the very first folder that we opened was a Philadelphia newspaper from 1808. And right in the middle on the front page of this newspaper was that notice by James Aiken. And that is, for me, that was such a eureka moment. It was, I'd been fighting for this notice to try to find it. And then it was lurking in the Morse Jumel Mansion, as one of 30 newspapers that they had. And that for me was such a fun discovery. Yeah. And the name was misspelled. So Aiken's last name, it's A-K-I-N, but in the newspaper notice, it's A-K-E-N. And it was a good notice. So I was really happy that I found it because he included a lot more information in it. I was so happy to find it. So that was a fun archival discovery and an archival moment.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I will turn things over to you to tell folks more about your book and show us some of these beautiful images.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to share my screen now. You can tell me if you can see it. I hope so. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Firstly, to Clayton, Angela, Anne, Paul, and Kayla behind the scenes for organizing this series. I remember during the pandemic sitting in this very room with a baby on my lap, logging into some of the early bookworms. So it's really nice to be here and to be able to introduce my book, Prints of a New Kind: Political Caricature in the United States. And just to start off, as Paul asked me about how I came to this topic, I wanted to show just some of these British caricatures, the vibrancy and how vivid they really are. And these are just a few of the caricatures made in the early 1790s. These caricatures made in London, published in London, were printed with such immediacy. There were so many caricatures published every day, every week, every month. There were lots of artists also partaking in caricature. So you had artists like James Gillray and Thomas Rowlandson, who were trained artists, and they were now becoming these masters of caricature. And you had other caricaturists that were dabbling in it who really saw the success of somebody like James Gillray and Thomas Rowlandson. So these were some of the caricatures that I was being confronted with when I was studying British caricature. And when I turned my attention to the United States, I was a bit disappointed to see that in 1 year, you might only have 1 or 2 or 3 caricatures being published. The caricatures you see before you are all made in 1790. They were all published in the spring, summer of 1790, and they all are on a very specific event that was happening in New York at that time, and that was the removal of the capital city from New York to Philadelphia. And this was a really important moment for New Yorkers. There are newspaper notices and advertisements about how disappointed New Yorkers were, how angry they were that the capital was being removed. So I was really fascinated to start with just how few caricatures were being made during this period. But the caricatures that were being made were absolutely seen by others. So what I love about these three caricatures in particular, and if you look on this print, the View of Congress, you can see these wonderful creases in the paper itself from being folded and being sent to a family member or a friend. And we know that these caricatures, these three in particular, were indeed sent in letters, maybe not these impressions, but impressions of these caricatures, because the politicians actually wrote home to their family members describing the prints themselves. And we also know that Thomas Jefferson was also interested in caricature. And the title of my book, Prints of a New Kind, actually comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson writes to his daughter, Maria or Mary. And what he writes to her, it's really a lovely letter about, please write me back, a father to his daughter. But he also says to her, I send you some prints of a new kind for your amusement. I send several to enable you to be generous to your friends. And it's really unclear what Thomas Jefferson was sending to his daughter, which caricatures. His account book is still in existence, and he did purchase caricatures in April of 1790. Whether they were British caricatures that had been imported to the United States, it's not clear, or if he purchased one of the caricatures that were made in New York for this removal of Congress. But what I love about this letter and about many of the other letters from politicians is that they were writing to their wives or to their daughters, and they were talking about the prints. And it wasn't just necessarily a male type of thing to look at these caricatures, but that they were sending them on to their daughters, to their female family members. So I'll go back for just one moment. So these are just a sampling of the caricatures that were made in the 1790s. There was a fourth caricature as well that was made. And also politicians would write home about that fourth caricature. So even though that caricature no longer survives that we know of, that I've been able to locate in a public collection, we do know that there was a fourth caricature also made of this subject. That caricature had Alexander Hamilton in it, John Jay. Jefferson was also included in that caricature, but unfortunately no impressions have survived, or they have survived and we just haven't located them yet. But this is, again, just a very small sampling of the caricatures that were made, and all by different hands. So at this point, a lot of the caricatures being made in the United States are being made by different artists, different individuals that are really taking this topical event that is of such interest and monetizing it by doing a political caricature. But it's also very likely that the artists that were making these prints were very much aware of what was being done in England at that time. So in this time, in the 1790s, British caricatures were being imported to the United States, to New York, to Boston, and to Philadelphia. So it might have been possible that these anonymous cartoonists were also aware of what was going on in London in this period. So Thomas Jefferson, he writes to his daughter in 1790, but he also writes again to another of his daughters in 1793. And he's including caricature prints in this letter to his daughter. So he's writing firstly in 1790 from New York to Virginia, and then in 1793, the capital has indeed moved to Philadelphia. So he's writing from Philadelphia in 1793 to his family in Virginia. And what's fascinating about this particular letter, not just that it's a letter to his daughter, but also that it was written in August of 1793. And we know that in August of 1793, or in the summer of 1793, there was a caricature made of George Washington entitled The Funeral of George Washington and James Wilson, King and Judge. And James Wilson was a Supreme Court judge who also was represented in this print with George Washington. So Thomas Jefferson writes to his daughter that he is enclosing caricatures, and it's very likely he was enclosing caricatures of the funeral of George Washington. I can't be entirely certain, but because there were so few prints made in 1793, and because of the time in which he wrote the letter, it's more than likely that it was this caricature. We also know that George Washington saw this print. So we know this from Thomas Jefferson's cabinet notes, that George Washington was shown the print in front of Congress, and that George Washington was none too pleased to see the caricature. And he got much inflamed, as you can read here, and he got into one of those passions where he cannot command himself. So he was not pleased that there was a caricature of him being sent to the guillotine. Washington was not the only individual that saw this print, though. It was widely known. It was published in the print itself. In terms of where it circulated is a bit unclear, but descriptions of it could be found in newspapers from August of 1793 onwards into January or February of 1794. So, and you have this wonderful notice just saying that they're also being destroyed, they're soon destroyed. And this goes into our poll question as well. What would you do? And, you know, it's not known if George Washington himself sent anybody to destroy these prints. It could just be that his supporters destroyed them. But occasionally you find references in this time period from the 1790s to the 1820s about caricatures being destroyed. And it was more than likely that somebody was just so enraged by being represented that they would send out friends or family members to collect them and destroy them. So in terms of who would have known about this caricature, whether they saw the print or not, the description was still found in newspapers. And this isn't a full description. There were other descriptions published, but you have this visual, you have a representation of the president with a coffin and a guillotine. So already your mind is conjuring up what that could be. There's a portrait of Washington, a coffin behind him or near him, and then a guillotine. Other descriptions talk about his head already being chopped off and being in a basket, which would have been very similar to some of the caricatures that were made in London. So these are British caricatures, not American caricatures. And these were all made for the French Revolution around 1793 of King Louis going to the guillotine. And it's entirely possible that, again, the caricaturists might have had some, might have seen prints similar to this. Maybe these caricatures made their way over. I wasn't able to find reference to any of these three caricatures, but certainly in 1793, there were caricatures being sent from London onwards to America. And another reference to this George Washington caricature actually comes from Thomas Adams. So John Adams' son, he writes to his mother Abigail about this this caricature of George Washington. And Abigail is interesting because she herself purchased at least one caricature when she was in London, a British caricature. So she already had this interest in caricature. And I love that her son then writes her with news of Philadelphia and says that there is this caricature of George Washington being sent to the guillotine and everybody is seeing it. So the time period of my book is 1790 to the late 1820s. And for me, this is a period where it's the groundwork for, or the foundation for future caricatures that come in the 1830s and onwards. This is a time in which artists are working in etching and engraving. Lithography only starts to become interesting to the caricaturists working in caricature in the 1820s. And it's a bit slow for some of the older caricaturists to really find their footing with lithography. It's new for them. So this is a period in which engraving and etching are really ruling the day. So the caricatures being made are not many in number. They're quite low in number, especially when compared to London. And like I said, there's so few and far between the caricatures that are being made. So in any one year, there's just so few images being made. And this really stops in the late 1820s, early 1830s. And there's this really big explosion of caricature because of lithography, because it's so much cheaper to produce. And you can print so many more caricatures from a lithographic stone than you can necessarily from a plate. So the caricatures that I'm showing you here, these are all associated with William Cobbett, the British radicalist. He arrives in Philadelphia in the mid-1790s, and he sets up a shop in Philadelphia where he is selling books, pamphlets. He has a shop window where he's plastering prints on the outside, so that an audience walking by or a group of passerbys will look into the shop window and see what he's selling. And William Cobbett is fascinating because he's also selling caricatures, and it's possible he's also behind the design and execution of caricatures, and he's hiring caricaturists to work on caricatures for him. So you see here this top print, this is the Paris Monster. Down here is the Times, a political portrait, which he also sold. And then this is a British caricature that he sold as well by James Gillray. And this is fascinating for me because so much of what Cobbett was doing during this period has been saved and archived. So his account books can be found at the American Antiquarian Society. And the account books are fascinating because he's actually notating down all of the books that he's selling, and then interspersed in there are the prints as well. So for example, with the Paris Monster, the caricature up here, he had 99 impressions of this caricature. And this is the only caricature during this time period from 1789 to 1828, where there's a real number associated with it. There were 99 impressions that William Cobbett had to sell. 90 went to another bookseller, and the 9 other impressions were sold to various individuals. The Times, a political portrait, he had quite a few that he sold as well, and they're referenced in, I'll go to the next slide, in his account book, and these are just 2 of the pages from his account book. And he, of course, is also advertising that he has these. So it's really pulling together the caricature, the newspaper, advertisements, and then, of course, the accounts to get an idea of when these prints were made. So down to really not just a year, but also a month when they were published. Because a lot of these caricatures during the time period don't have any information about when they were published. There are no dates associated with them. Sometimes there are titles, sometimes there aren't. Often there aren't even signatures from the artists themselves. So this type of information, pulling this together, is really great because you can find out exactly when these prints were made. And for the Times, a political portrait shown down here, the dates associated with this print were really quite varied from 1790 to 1795 to 1800. Is it George Washington? Is it John Adams? You know, who was the leading figure? Who could possibly be in this chariot? And in going through the newspapers and finding the advertisement, when the advertisements begin, when they stop, looking at when the caricature was sold by William Cobbett, it's possible to go to the exact date by month at least and say that it was made in July of 1798. It's likely John Adams. It could be George Washington. I think it's John Adams. So there's a lot more information that really can be taken out of other documents that are being made during this period and that were saved. And this is just to go back to William Cobbett and how he represented his shop in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, we don't have any images, any American caricatures that show the outside of a shop, you know, showing an audience looking in and seeing what they were seeing. So these are 3 British caricatures. The first 2 show exterior of a shop. And then there's this wonderful caricature here by Thomas Rowlandson of all these individuals poring over a caricature portfolio. And this brings me to the 2 artists that really emerged during this time period, James Aiken and William Charles. And I can't show you portraits of them because I haven't been able to locate a portrait of James Aiken or of William Charles. James Aiken was born in 1774. He dies in 1846, so well after the time period of my book. But he was born in South Carolina. He goes to Philadelphia. He's then in London. He's then back in Philadelphia. He goes to New York. He goes to Newburyport, Massachusetts. Then he goes back to Philadelphia, where he stays for the rest of his life, and he produces caricatures. William Charles was born in Edinburgh. He goes to London. And what's great about William Charles, what's really fascinating, is that because he's in London in the early 1800s, he really sees this market for caricature, and he takes that with him to the United States. He's not the best draftsman. He's not the best artist. He can't compete with James Gillray and Thomas Rowlandson. So he buys up as many impressions of caricatures as he can in London, and he takes those impressions with him to New York and then onwards to Philadelphia, where he sells them as his own. He erases the name of Gilray and of Rowlandson. He sees what sells in London, what doesn't sell in London, and he really brings that to the United States. So he has a very specific mindset for caricature, whereas James Aiken in some ways falls into caricature. I don't know if that's the right term to really say about James Aiken, but he strives for so many other things and then finds that his calling is in caricature, and he only really acknowledges that towards the end of his life. So James Aiken is the artist responsible for the caricature on the cover of my book, A Philosophic Cock. This is in itself a fascinating caricature that maybe we'll talk about in the discussion. I just wanted to bring it up briefly here because it was discovered in one of these portfolios. So this is that same image that I showed you earlier of the individuals poring over this portfolio book of caricatures. And this is fascinating. He doesn't sign it. The other caricatures within this portfolio that were only recently discovered do have his initials. He does sign them. You can see here this wonderful advertisement for the portfolio, Entertainment for Tea Parties. It's a book of caricatures consisting of handsome figures, pleasing likenesses, ugly but necessary positions, and they could be hired by the hour, day, or evening. And this was also a very British thing to do. This is the only instance that I have uncovered for a caricature portfolio from this period. And it's remarkable that this actually survived and can be seen now in the American Antiquarian Society with about 9 other caricatures by James Aiken and many British caricatures as well. So this was a way, at least in New Hampshire, in which you could see caricatures, and that would have been in this type of portfolio. And the caricature itself, A Philosophic Cock, is Thomas Jefferson represented with Sally Hemings. And this is one of his more popular caricatures, and this is frequently reproduced in history books and in articles on Jefferson. So at the Clements Library, I just wanted to mention this briefly because I've mentioned that you know, in the course of my research on this time period, I was looking at newspapers, I was looking at diaries, I was looking at letters, but I was also looking at court documents. And I really found a wealth of information in a lot of these court documents. And this is one court document that survives at the Clements Library. And James Aiken, as I said, he was a really prolific writer. He often would advertise what he was up to. And in 1805, he put out advertisements stating what he was up to in that time, and that he was looking essentially for commissions. And he cast the net very wide, and he advertised in newspapers all along the East Coast, and he did in fact get offers and requests to do engravings. And this is one in particular from an individual in Portland, Maine. And Aiken actually got the letter and he did the engraving and sent it off with a colleague of his and with the amount that he wanted to be paid. The individual, John McCowan, said, "I'm not paying this," and eventually went to court. And the court actually ruled in Aiken's favor. But what's fascinating about some of these documents that survive with, you know, these letters is that you see testimonials. So there are other engravers commenting and saying, no, this was the right price. James Aiken was right to request this amount of money. And McCowan saying, no, it wasn't what I requested. I don't want to pay this. And so you get a sense of who these individuals were during the period as well and how they were operating, and particularly Aiken, being in a place like Newburyport, Massachusetts. He also was trying to get commissions from outside of Newburyport. So he's a really fascinating character. And these are fascinating documents at the Clements. I also wanted to mention William Charles. So the Clements Library has a few caricatures by him from the War of 1812. And this is when William Charles really comes into his own, and he partners with several others, and he does some caricatures during this time period that are widely known today. But he also, as I mentioned, when he arrives in the United States, he takes with him caricatures that had been made by others in London, and this is one example. So this caricature is actually so this is the Clements Library impression. This is from the American Antiquarian Society. This is the French original. This is the James Gillray caricature. And then this is William Charles copying the caricature. And what I found really interesting about the Clements Library, and I think the American Antiquarian Society has an impression of this as well, is that below you see this New York published by John and M. Path, and the address in Broadway. And Charles is claiming to have made this caricature in 1807 in New York. This was roughly around the same time that James Aiken was in New York. And because these two artists were working at the same time, I was always trying to bring them together in some way to find how they knew each other. They must have known each other, but neither of them ever references the other. There's nothing in the archives that actually brings the two together. And I just couldn't believe it. And then when this was brought to my attention, that was another eureka moment, because Aiken also sold caricatures through John Path around the same time period. And it's lovely to see this because it means that Charles, even if they weren't connected, seeing each other face to face, there was this middleman in a way that was selling both their caricatures. And it's really the first time that it brings the two of them together. So I think I'll leave it there with these two examples from the Clements Library, and then I'm looking forward to talking more and having a discussion.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was really fantastic. And I will turn things over to my erstwhile colleague, Clayton Lewis, who I think has some questions for you.
Thank you, Paul. Nice to see you again. Hello, everybody. For starters, Allison, I love this project and I love the book. And before I forget to mention it, I think for print collectors and curators out there, in addition to it being lavishly illustrated and tremendous archival research, your appendix is really useful, where you've updated a lot of the work of previous curators who have traced American caricatures, but you've made some really important additions and expansions to it. So I highly recommend this book to anybody that's either amateur or a professional with interests. Going back to that, you're mentioning of William Cobbett and his print shop, his window of his shop with caricatures and prints pasted into the window, and we've seen prints published by print publishers showing their own shops with this. It implies that the audience for these prints was much bigger than the people that were buying them, that they were public. Do you think that this is there's been some debate about this, but do you think this is accurate?
That's a really good question. I'm not so sure. I think what's interesting about this time period is that you really can't speak generally, because I think it is a case by case with each print, because some of the prints that I found, some of the caricatures, there's one that has survived. Trying to find information about that one caricature was just impossible. They, not referenced in newspapers, trying to find the individuals that were represented, going to the letters, trying to see if they knew about the caricature. So I think, in terms of Cobbett, what I love is that, especially with the British caricatures that were coming over, these were likely remainders. These were likely prints that didn't sell. They were published in London in, let's say, 1793, and then they make their way to Philadelphia in 1796. So the immediacy of the caricature is no longer relevant. So ship it off to the States, and maybe somebody will be interested in buying it there. But I think what I found really interesting was this circulation, that that these were caricatures that did move, that and even with Cobbett, for example, selling those impressions of a Paris monster, he sold them on to Bill Davies, who was another bookshop owner and seller. And then you see references to it in Richmond, Virginia, and in Albany, New York, and that it's being sold by booksellers there. So I think, I can't speak I can't speak generally, but for the caricatures that I was able to trace, I think some of them did have a wider movement. But then, for example, Philosophic Cock, I'm not convinced that that had a wide circulation at all. So I think it is case by case.
Yeah, and am I right? That's the only known copy is the one at the American Antiquarian
That's
Society?
the only known impression. Only
Yeah.
known impression. But when I do these talks, I'm always hoping that somebody in the audience will say, no, I have one. I found one. Because you never know. I know with the Times of Political Portrait, the only known impression was at New York Historical Society. And then recently another one came to light. So you never know. And
Fingers crossed.
yeah, exactly. Always.
I find it sort of entertaining and interesting that William Charles was just so blatantly not just stealing other people's images and copying them in his own engravings, but actually selling their prints as his own. And and today we seem to be much more aware of copyright infringement as an issue, but yet his whole business model is based on that. Did anybody care back then? Were the other print publishers angry with him?
So I think in London they were. So William Charles is really interesting because, like I said, he was born in Edinburgh. He only starts making caricatures when he's in his late 20s. So he must have had another career before this. What that was, we don't know yet. But he goes to London and he's copying. So he's copying from Gillray. He's copying from this is very confusing, but there was another British caricaturist by the name of Charles Williams. So he's copying from him. And I think he found it very difficult in London. And I think this is why he goes to the United States, because he must have had either a friend or a family member or somebody telling him, come here, there are no caricaturists here, it's wide open for you. Come over, bring plates, bring impressions, and sell them, because the number of caricatures that were in circulation, that were circulating to the United States from London, were such a small amount, and again, really irregular. So it was rare for me to go to the newspapers and to find a title of a British caricature that was on offer in the United States. So I think, some people might have known about Gillray and Rowlandson, but not to the extent they would have known about him in London. So I think for Charles, it was just a free-for-all. He could take what he had and he could just say, these are mine, and nobody would know.
Those were the days for thieves.
Those were the
right?
days, yeah. But I mean, even so, there were copyright laws, and Aiken in the early 1800s, he's putting copyrights on his prints, on his caricatures. Not all of them, but he does enough of them where you see the copyright by, and later on you can find those impressions at the Library of Congress having been entered for copyright. This is in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and then onwards until his death. But Charles, I could be wrong. I don't think he does this during the War of 1812, but I could be wrong.
Interesting. It certainly wasn't a great era for diplomatic relations between the US and Britain.
Yeah, and I mean, even so, Charles is still lifting from British caricatures during the War of 1812. So this is when he really comes into his own, as I said, and he's printing so many more caricatures during this period, and he sets up a partnership with another individual in Philadelphia, and they claim they're going to be printing caricatures every, I think, 4 caricatures a month or something. This doesn't really take hold, and he's disappointed about it. But even the caricatures that he does produce, these are copies of Rowlandson and Gillray. So he still has somebody in London sending him topical caricatures, and he's still copying them.
So the scope of your book is right on the cusp of the emergence of a racial satire in America. And this is something that interests me personally. The very early emergence of the visual vocabulary of race as mostly we think of as being defined by Edward Clay and his Life in Philadelphia series later on. Did you see any precursors to that in your work?
There's one, if I can share my screen again, let me see if I can do this. There's one caricature that I just wanted to show. So there's obviously a philosophic cock, which was early in the early 1800s. But then there's this caricature, if I can get to it, sorry. This caricature here. So this is by Aiken, and this is from 1820. This is at the New York Historical Society. And I think Library of Congress or HSP has an impression as well. And this was shocking to me when I saw it at the New York Historical Society, because this is 1820s. And this is a caricature against a politician in Philadelphia. This character here, this is Joseph Hester, who was a slave owner. And James Aiken in this period is getting a lot more political. I mean, so much so that he's running for political office. He's really trying to find his way into politics at this time. And he produces this caricature. And this was the first, at least in this time period, where I actually saw something of this kind. It's not repeated in the 1820s until, as you said, The Life of Philadelphia, and it's not really repeated before. So there were references to newspapers that, you know, referenced this, what was going on with the Missouri Compromise in 1820, but those characters have not survived, at least not that I've been able to find. But this is why in the catalog I've included the descriptions, because there's always the hope that these prints might be found. This caricature, I'm not clear on how many were published. This was likely for a private group in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. So it could have been a low number, it might have been higher, but 2 of the impressions have survived in public collections. But this, again, the representations, it's shocking.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, before I turn this back over to Paul and we open this up for our audience questions, I wanted to put in a plug for one of your many sponsors, the American Historical Print Collectors Society, of which we are both actively involved, and is the organization through which we originally met. And the American Historical Print Collectors Society is a wonderful organization of enthusiastic, like-minded collectors, curators, and just general interest in people with an eye to American visual culture. And our surveys of the membership have indicated that among the things that our group values are the face-to-face meetings. And we've got a regular schedule of meetings across the country. The Print Collectors Annual Meeting moves every year, but we also do some smaller regional meetings, and we've got a couple of them coming up. In Ridgefield, Connecticut, on Friday, September 22nd, there will be a regional meeting at the Weir Farm, the home of the American Impressionist artist J. Alden Weir. And this is a property that's now managed by the National Park Service. We also have a date for a meeting at the New York Public Library print room on December 8th of this year. And then stay tuned for information about a meeting in Asheville next year. Please look at the American Print Collectors Society website. And if you enjoy this type of material in these conversations, consider joining and meeting us at one of these wonderful historic collections.
And I have to say again, you know, I applied for funding from the American Historical Print Collectors Society with, you know, in the hopes of being able to reproduce so many of the images in color. And I was very fortunate to get a very generous grant from them. And this made the book so much better to be able to have so many images in color. And there are other grants, there's other fellowships, research fellowships that the American Historical Print Collectors Society funds. So it's definitely worth going to the website and seeing what's on offer. I'm happy to help plug it.
Excellent, thank you. Paul, would you like to bring on the questions from our audience in the Q&A?
I would, but I will turn it over to Angela first because she has housekeeping notes.
Yes, so thank you, Allison. So wonderful, and Clayton and Paul for leading conversation with Allison as well. And just one more time, everyone, in case you missed it at the beginning, there is a discount code for Allison's book. And so I wanted to remind you of that. And then just a couple of housekeeping things. We continue to have hours for our centennial exhibit, Building on a Century of Collecting at the Clements Library. You can see this exhibit in person Monday through Friday from noon to 4. And today is the Ann Arbor Art Fair as well. So if you happen to be on campus, we will have a little tent set up on the north side of the building between Hatcher and Shapiro. with all sorts of centennial giveaways. So please stop by and see us if you're on campus. Once again, I'd like to thank Doug Johnson for sponsoring today's bookworm and remind everybody that if you're interested in sponsorship, you're welcome to contact myself or Anne. And we hope to see you at the next bookworm. Once you sign up, you receive a reminder every month. And then if you're unable to join us live, you can, you'll receive an email, which you'll receive later today with the recording and a list of resources. So with that, I'll turn it over for questions.
Great, thank you, Angela. So got a lot of questions in the Q&A and some in the chat. And I just want to say it's so great to see so many old friends on the participant list. I was just at the SHEAR conference in Philadelphia over the weekend, and it's almost like being back in person with all these wonderful people. I will start off with a question from Gigi Barnhill. How many of the other caricatures are known by only one impression? You talked about the philosophic cock and
Yeah.
others.
I would say about a quarter of them. So maybe 20 or so from this period that only one impression is known. And most of those are from the earlier period. So from 1789 to roughly 1810 or so. Once William Charles enters into the mix, there are just so many more impressions that he made, or so many more caricatures that he made impressions of, and those have been saved. So it's more towards the earlier period where there are so many more anonymous caricatures being published, and I haven't been able to locate the artists. I haven't been able to attribute an artist to these caricatures. They seem to be one-offs. So it's really from the earlier period. Once William Charles gets going and James Aiken is producing more, especially Newburyport, there are at least 3, 4, 5, 6, and sometimes more caricatures that have survived, that have been saved. There are a few caricatures that I found at the Connecticut Historical Society. And these are fascinating. These are around the War of 1812, and they're the only ones I found. They're only at the Connecticut Historical Society, and I haven't been able to find newspaper references to them. And these are fascinating. Some of them even talk about, having to be suppressed, to get back to something that Clayton kind of brought up about copyright, but also with suppression. So, in 1798, we had these laws, the copyright laws and the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so some of the caricatures were suppressed in that time period. And at least one caricature has a little notation saying that this had to be hidden away and couldn't be shown to anybody. So I love these little notations on some of the caricatures by those that owned them and saw them in that time.
Did that batch at Connecticut Historical mostly have to do with the Hartford Convention, or are they earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with Hartford Convention. Yeah.
Big years. So I have a couple of questions from Tom about the origins of political caricature. So how early does the art of political caricature start? And what is the tradition in other European countries of political caricature at the time that you're looking at?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think it can go back so much further in the United States. I mean, obviously we have Join or Die, we have caricatures made before the American Revolution. I really wanted to start it with the founding, and I couldn't find any caricatures made in the late 1780s. There was one caricature of George Washington, which has not survived, called The Entry, which has been noted in lots of history books, but we have descriptions of it so we can have a general idea of what was being represented. And that's why I started at 1789. But I think you could go back, much further. I just started with America's founding, or at least as a democratic nation. But I think you could go back, obviously, much earlier. And with other countries, I mean, Germany, I live in Germany, so maybe I can speak a little bit to Germany, because it was made up of so many different states before it became a unified country. The caricatures that were being made were very specific to such a small location, to the states themselves. And they were also getting quite a bit of caricatures imported from London. So, I mean, the print market in London was just so overwhelming. It wasn't just staying in London. They were really going everywhere. They were going to Paris. Some of the information I found about British caricatures arriving in America came from French newspapers because they were being sent on to Paris. They go to Spain, they go to Portugal, but because, so like Germany, for example, because it wasn't a unified country, it was very separate. And in some respects, you see that in the United States as well, particularly in the earlier period, because there's no one city. You know, you have Boston where there's caricature being made, in Philadelphia and New York. And what I did find interesting was once the capital goes to DC, caricaturists don't follow. They stay in Philadelphia, they stay in New York, they go to Boston. But even though the politicians are going to DC, they might not be living there because it's still a swamp, but even so, the caricaturists are not going with them. They're staying in Philadelphia and the bigger cities. Yeah.
Why would you move to Washington if you didn't have to?
Especially in 1800.
Yeah, exactly. So Tom has a question. So your book is mostly about separately printed caricatures.
Yeah.
Did caricatures show up as illustrations within other published texts, or were they just a separately printed phenomenon?
Just separately printed. There are some that show up in pamphlets, sometimes on the front page of a pamphlet. I didn't include those in the book because that would have opened up a whole new can of worms. So I stayed with separately published caricatures. But I think that's a fantastic research topic as well, because I mean, Cobbett includes in his pamphlets caricatures, but they're relatively small, usually one or two figures, sometimes of, you know, a face or of a profile. And I felt that would be really entering into a whole new world. But no, that's a good question. They did exist in other formats, but not to the extent that the separately published ones do.
So Cheryl has a couple questions about the prints themselves. So was there a standard size for these separately printed caricatures? And also, how much would they have cost? And was there a difference in cost between hand-colored and not?
Yeah, so there were different costs for colored and uncolored. It was obviously cheaper to buy them uncolored. The price ranges from 10 cents in 1790s to $1.25. So these were relatively expensive, especially the colored caricatures that were a bit more expensive. Not all caricatures, it's not, how do I put this? It's only a few number of caricatures that I've been able to locate the prices that they would have sold for. This isn't always included in newspaper advertisements. So I really had to do a bit of digging. Cobbett is wonderful because of his account book. So we know how much he sold some of the caricatures for and at a discount. You see, as you know, the months go on and the caricatures aren't selling, they get a little bit cheaper. So yeah, it's again, it's not uniform how much the caricature sold for. Each caricature had a different price value. And I'm sorry, what was the start of the question? The first question.
Was there a standard size?
No, all different. So you see with William Charles, the sizes are relatively the same, but the Times of Political Portrait, for example, is relatively big. So that was one of the caricatures I showed early on. A Philosophic Cock is about half that size and is square. So the sizes are all different. The 1790s caricatures, one of the caricatures is relatively big, the other two are relatively small. So there wasn't a standard uniform size until William Charles. And then he really brings with him his cachet of British caricatures, which were all roughly the same size.
Okay. So Pamela has a couple questions. One is, before these satirical sketches and prints, was printed verbal satire common? And I guess I have a question to add on to that is, were the British caricaturists that you talk about kind of putting into visual practice something that was modeled on writers like Addison, Steele, and Pope, and then in the sort of 18th century British satirical tradition?
It definitely in London this was happening, but not so in the United States, not in this time period. And the ones that do exist are usually copies of British caricatures. So the original idea, it doesn't start in the United States, it starts in London.
Okay.
Yeah, at least in this time period. It really radically changes after the 1830s.
So Pamela has another question. What was the status of caricaturists in the time you're looking at? Were they a separate category from fine artists, although a lot of them did create just sort of regular
Yeah.
prints. Were they associated with journalism? Like, where did they fit?
Yeah, good. That's a really good question. It's a bit unclear. So because this was such a new medium, James Aiken, he's one of the caricaturists that we know. He did portraits, he did engravings of maps. He was really trying to find his place, and he was trying to elevate himself, but also when he gives into caricature, he's trying to elevate caricature. William Charles, he's associated with Matthew Carey. He does engravings for him. This is not a way to earn a living, right? So you can't make enough money to provide for your family doing just caricature. So they were also doing lots of other things. They were engraving medical bottles and door knockers. And there's a wonderful document that survives at the Library Company in which James Aiken has an apprentice, and he's detailing what the apprentice was helping him do and all the engravings that he was doing for him. So it wasn't just caricature. They had to take on other work. So it was pretty low, to be honest. James Aiken, I think, didn't see himself that way. He wanted really, as I said, to elevate himself. And I think because Aiken had spent time in London, he saw what was happening with the print culture there and the market there. Charles had been there too. And I think they really desired to have that same kind of status that Gillray and Rowlandson had in London. And it was just too early for them. That comes later with artists working in lithography. They were just too early for it.
Right. So Tom has a question. Are there explicit caricatures featuring the conflict between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists?
Yes, and a lot of them haven't survived. So I have descriptions of them in my catalog because there are references to these caricatures in newspapers from this time period. So I can't speak to what they looked like or how big they were. I don't know even to the extent that they circulated, really. But yes, there were a number of caricatures that were made during this time.
Right.
Yeah.
So Tim has a question about the sort of the tail end of your time period. Have you found caricatures of Andrew Jackson? And if so, do you have any stories about his reaction to them?
So what's interesting about Jackson, so the caricatures that really are made of Jackson come a bit later. James Aiken does a few caricatures of Jackson during the 1820s. Jackson, of course, runs for president, doesn't become president in 1824. So there are a number of caricatures that depict Jackson. And Aiken, as I said, he was entering into politics around this time. So he really saw himself as maybe Jackson's caricaturist, as somebody who would slay his foes with caricature. And he applies to Jackson to become the head of the patent office. And he doesn't get the job. And when he doesn't get the job, he turns on Jackson and starts doing really nasty caricatures of Jackson in the 1830s when Jackson is president. And I haven't found reference during the 1820s where Jackson is referring to caricatures, but he does write at one point to he had an artist that often did portraits of him, Ralph Earl, and he's writing to Earl and saying, oh, all of these individuals, they all want positions. I don't have time for this. And it's around the same time that Aiken is really bombarding him with letters asking for this position. So it's possible, he had in his head, Aiken, writing to him and saying, I'm doing caricatures in support of you. I will continue to support you. And then he doesn't get the job. And then he goes after Jackson. So in this period, I haven't found reference, but there were caricatures obviously made of him during this period. And then, I mean, after the 1830s, it's just, so many caricatures of Jackson. Yeah.
Right. So I just have a question about the logistics of this business. I mean, how hard was it to set yourself up in the engraving business? You needed special tools, you needed copper plates, you needed a special press, and a lot of that stuff wasn't made here. So how hard was it?
Yeah, I looked into, so when Aiken dies, when Charles dies, they both die with presses that they owned. Aiken at one point places a notice saying that he has a printing press. He was sharing his premise with somebody in Newburyport. He shared a premise with somebody in Philadelphia. William Charles had his own bookshop and he claimed to have his own printing press. I looked quite a bit into how, where would you find a printing press? I did find that a lot of printers, when they were leaving a city, they would sell their printing press. So it's possible that Aiken and Charles would purchase secondhand. I don't think Charles brought a printing press with him from London. I think it's more likely he arrives in New York and buys one either there or in Philadelphia, and probably a sale from somebody else. But they were often, as you said, they were often imported from London, or they were, I think there was somebody in Philadelphia that was making printing presses at this time as well, but they would have been very expensive. And I think, particularly Aiken, when he's starting out in Philadelphia, I think he was probably renting a press from somebody. And I think, quite a few engravers were coming together, pooling their resources and using this one press because he wasn't producing enough to necessarily warrant having his own press at this time. But it would have been expensive, and Aiken had an apprentice, William Charles has an apprentice later on. So they did have, people helping them. William Charles also had his wife helping him. James Aiken had his wife helping him. So it was also a family affair. William Charles had like 8 kids. They were involved a little bit later on. So, where they could cut corners, bringing in family members, they did, but it was expensive to do this. And, to not make so many caricatures as they were doing in London at that same time period, it would have been very difficult in terms of financially surviving.
Right. Yeah, and a press that is sitting idle isn't making any money. So just one last question about kind of the business of this. Tom wonders, did Benjamin Franklin publish any caricatures in his career as a printer?
I am not 100% sure. I don't think so.
Good.
I don't think so. I'm sure, because he traveled so much, I'm sure he would have seen them,
Right.
Especially the British. But I didn't look into that when I was doing the research, so I can't speak to it, unfortunately.
Yeah, some of our colleagues who are on from Philadelphia would certainly know better. I don't know that he had a copperplate press.
He did.
So, Clayton, do you have any final questions?
No, I don't, but I really enjoyed this conversation, Allison. It's really, really fantastic.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I really, really enjoyed it.
So great to see you.
Same here.
Yes,
Angela?
thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.